In 1999, Radio Shack operated more stores across America than McDonald's had restaurants. 7,000 storefronts, 5 countries, a name so common it barely needed saying aloud. Behind the counter sat the machine that had quietly taught a generation how to think in code, the TRS-80, humming to life in bedrooms from Ohio to Oregon, its keyboard clacking under fingers that had never touched a computer before. Fathers brought sons in for batteries and left with soldering irons and a shared secret language. By 2015, the doors were closed. Quietly. Almost nobody noticed the last one shutting. How does a company that taught America to love technology fail to survive the very future it helped build? This is the story of the store that got there first and still lost the race. Boston, 1921. The waterfront still smelled of tar and salt, and somewhere above a hardware shop on Brattle Street, two brothers were unpacking crates of vacuum tubes. Theodore and Milton Deutschman had grown up watching this strange new hobby of amateur radio spread through New England like a fever. Men were building their own transmitters in attics and barns, tapping out messages to strangers hundreds of miles away, chasing signals through static for the simple thrill of being heard. The Deutschmans saw something practical in that obsession. Nobody selling to these hobbyists actually understood what they needed. Parts were scattered across a dozen suppliers, mail order was slow and unreliable, and the men running the shops rarely knew a resistor from a relay. So the brothers opened a shop that did things differently. They called it Radio Shack, a nod to the small wooden cabin bolted to a ship's deck where the radio operator worked alone, headphones clamped tight, tuning through the noise of the Atlantic. It was a fitting name for two brothers who understood that their customers weren't ordinary shoppers. They were seekers, people hunting for a very specific coil, a particular condenser, a spare tube for a transmitter that absolutely could not wait until next week. The first store was modest. A narrow front room stacked floor to ceiling with parts bins, the air thick with the smell of solder and machine oil, mail order catalogs piled on every flat surface waiting to be filled and shipped. There was no glamour to it. Bare bulbs hung overhead. The floorboards creaked under the weight of transformers and battery cells. But for the men who walked through that door, it felt like walking into the one place in America that spoke their language. Word spread fast among ham radio operators up and down the coast. Sailors passing through Boston Harbor stopped in for spare parts before shipping out again. Schoolboys with pocket money saved for months pressed their faces to the glass, dreaming of building their first crystal set. Radio Shack's mail-order catalog reached enthusiasts as far as the Midwest. Men who had never set foot in Boston, but felt somehow that they knew the place. The brothers' belief was simple, almost stubborn in its clarity. Sell to the people who actually understood what they were buying, and treat every customer like a fellow enthusiast rather than a mark to be upsold. It was a philosophy built on respect, the idea that a knowledgeable customer deserved a knowledgeable seller standing across the counter. For 4 decades, that idea was enough. Radio Shack grew slowly, steadily, a beloved name among hobbyists, but never a household one. It survived the Depression on the loyalty of men who would rather skip a meal than miss a part they needed. It survived the war years supplying radio components for a nation suddenly desperate for communication technology. But by the early 1960s, the company that the Deutschman brothers had built with such care was quietly dying. Poor credit decisions had buried it in unpaid receivables. The bank was circling. And 9 small stores were all that remained of a business once full of promise. What Radio Shack needed next wasn't another radio hobbyist. It needed someone who understood retail, someone from a completely different world, walking in with an entirely different kind of vision. That man was already on his way from Texas. By 1977, Radio Shack was no longer just a shop for hobbyists chasing static on the airwaves. It had become something else entirely, the place where an ordinary American family first touched the future. The TRS-80 sat on store shelves that autumn, a beige box with a chunky keyboard and a cathode ray monitor, priced low enough that a school teacher or a factory foreman could actually bring one home. Nobody had done that before. Computers belonged to universities, to corporations, to men in white coats standing in air-conditioned rooms the size of gymnasiums. Radio Shack put one on a kitchen table. Picture a Saturday afternoon in Ohio, 1978. A father leads his 12-year-old son through the glass door, past the pegboards of resistors and antenna wire, toward the corner where the TRS-80 waits, humming faintly. The boy sits down. His fingers find the keys. Green text blinks onto the screen. A few lines of basic code the salesman has already typed in. A simple program that draws a bouncing ball across the display. The boy watches it bounce. He doesn't fully understand what he's looking at, but he knows with total certainty that he wants to understand it. That scene played out in thousands of stores across the country, and it was no accident. Radio Shack's sales staff weren't hired off the street and handed a script. They were tinkerers themselves, men who had built their own crystal radios as boys, who could explain a capacitor or a transistor without condescension, who treated a customer's curiosity as something worth nurturing rather than rushing toward a sale. Walking into a Radio Shack in the late 70s didn't feel like shopping. It felt like being let in on a secret that the rest of the world hadn't caught up to yet. The store became a fixture of American ritual in ways that had nothing to do with computers at all. A CB radio for the family station wagon before a summer road trip, because everyone wanted to talk to truckers on the highway and hear their own handle crackle back through the static. A soldering iron and a bag of pars for a Cub Scout project, purchased the night before it was due. A replacement battery, a spare antenna, a length of speaker wire. Small, unglamorous errands that somehow always ended the same way, with a 5-minute conversation at the counter about whatever new gadget had just come in. By the early 1980s, that gadget was almost always a computer. Radio Shack computer centers, modest sections carved out of stores that had once sold nothing but parts, became the after-school hangout for a certain kind of American teenager. Boys who couldn't afford a TRS-80 of their own would linger for an hour after class, tapping out programs on the display models while a patient clerk let them stay, because he remembered being exactly that kid a decade earlier. Some of those teenagers would go on to careers in computing that nobody in that store could have predicted. Others simply carried the memory of that green glowing screen for the rest of their lives. The company wove itself into the culture in ways that felt effortless rather than manufactured. The TRS-80 became the computer that appeared in earnest news segments about the coming computer age, the machine that schools bought in bulk when they decided, almost overnight, that children needed to learn programming. For a brief, remarkable stretch, Radio Shack wasn't playing catch-up to anyone. It was the one showing America what a home computer could be. Employees felt that pride too. Working the counter at a Radio Shack in 1979 meant being treated, by customers, almost like a local authority on the future itself. Neighbors would stop a clerk at the grocery store to ask whether they should really buy one of those computers or whether it was just a fad. The answer, delivered with the quiet confidence of someone who'd watched 100 bouncing ball programs light up 100 screens, was always the same. This isn't going away. What made it irreplaceable wasn't the technology alone. Plenty of companies would eventually build better machines. It was the experience of being personally guided into something unfamiliar by someone who genuinely wanted you to understand it, in a small store within walking distance of home, at a price that didn't require a loan. What was it about that humming green screen, that patient voice behind the counter, that made an entire generation feel like the future was something they were personally invited into? That feeling, as extraordinary as it was, rested on a foundation nobody in the store could see cracking. The very thing that made Radio Shack special, its insistence on doing things its own way, was about to become the reason the rest of the industry began to leave it behind. The decision to turn Radio Shack into a national chain wasn't made by the Deutschman brothers. It was made by a Texan who had never sold a single vacuum tube in his life. Charles Tandy had built his career in leather goods, running a modest supply business out of Fort Worth. But by 1963, he had grown fascinated by consumer electronics and the retail model behind it. And when Radio Shack came up for sale, 9 stores, close to bankrupt, buried under nearly $800,000 in bad credit, Tandy saw not a failing company but an underused idea. He paid $300,000 for it, a sum so modest that few in the industry even noticed the sale had happened. What Tandy did next reshaped the company from the ground up. He shut down the unprofitable mail-order arm that had defined Radio Shack for 4 decades. He ended the credit sales that had nearly sunk it, and he made a decision that would define the next 30 years of the company's identity. He cut the number of items each store carried from roughly 40,000 down to 2,500, keeping only what he called the 20% that represents 80% of the sales. In place of name brand merchandise, Tandy pushed private label products manufactured by Radio Shack's own subsidiaries, cheaper to produce, more profitable to sell, and entirely under the company's control. It was an audacious bet, and it paid off almost immediately. From 9 stores in 1963, Radio Shack grew to over 100 within a few years. By 1975, 12 years after the purchase, the company operated more than 2,600 stores. The growth wasn't organic in the traditional sense. Tandy favored small, cheaply rented storefronts, little holes in the wall that could be opened fast and closed just as fast if a location didn't perform. It was retail expansion built for speed, not permanence. That speed created a particular kind of Radio Shack franchisee. Many were young men just out of military service, drawn to a business that required modest capital and rewarded technical know-how. Others were immigrants who had worked electronics counters for someone else and finally had the chance to run their own. For a returning veteran in 1968, a Radio Shack franchise offered something rare: a small storefront of his own, a product line he already understood, and a company back in Fort Worth that supplied the inventory and told him exactly how to stock the shelves. But that same centralized control came with a cost. Maintaining consistency across hundreds, then thousands of locations meant franchise owners had far less freedom than the word own implied. Product lines were dictated from headquarters. Private label branding meant a customer in Ohio and a customer in Oregon bought the exact same battery under the exact same name, whether they wanted a well-known brand or not. For owners who had once dreamed of building something personal, the reality often felt more like running someone else's system at street level. The original Boston store, the narrow room above Brattle Street where 2 brothers had once stacked vacuum tubes by hand, quietly faded from relevance as the chain exploded outward. It wasn't demolished or memorialized. It simply became one storefront among thousands, indistinguishable from a location in Tulsa or Sacramento, its founding history invisible to the customers walking in for batteries. For the employees swept up in this expansion, the moment felt like opportunity more than anything else. New stores meant new management positions, new territories, a career path that hadn't existed a decade earlier. Radio Shack was hiring constantly, training constantly, opening storefronts faster than most competitors could track. Nobody working the counter in 1975 was thinking about what centralized control might cost the brand's soul. They were thinking about the neighborhood 2 miles over that didn't have a Radio Shack yet, and wondering how soon it would. By the mid-1970s, the pace of expansion had turned a 9-store remnant of a bankrupt mail-order business into one of the fastest-growing retail chains in America. The stores were everywhere now. Strip malls, main streets, shopping centers springing up along new interstate exits. What had started as Charles Tandy's calculated bet was becoming something closer to a national institution, and the numbers were about to climb even higher, toward a peak that would make Radio Shack, for one remarkable stretch, the largest electronics retailer the world had ever seen. By the turn of the millennium, Radio Shack's footprint had swelled to roughly 7,500 stores across North America, a number so large it meant nearly every American lived within a short drive of one. This was no longer a regional chain with a clever business model. This was infrastructure, as familiar and unremarkable as a petrol station and every bit as essential to daily American life. That scale gave Radio Shack a peculiar kind of cultural weight. It wasn't glamorous the way a flagship department store might be. It didn't have a Christmas catalog that families circled around the dinner table. What it had instead was ubiquity, the quiet, constant presence of a store that was simply always there in every town, ready for whatever small technological need had just arisen. The TRS-80 had opened that door in 1977, but by the 1980s and into the 1990s, the ritual had deepened into something generational. A father who had bought his first computer parts at RadioShack in 1979 now brought his own son in for a Walkman battery, a set of speaker wires, a cordless phone. The counter clerk asking, "Anything else today?" had in some towns become as familiar a voice as the local pharmacists. Grandparents who had never touched a keyboard in their lives still knew exactly which store to walk into when a hearing aid battery died on a Sunday afternoon. Few images captured that peak more vividly than the sight of a Radio Shack computer center in the early 80s. A small, carved-out corner of a store otherwise stacked with resistors and antenna wire, suddenly humming with the future. Local news crews filmed segments there when they wanted to explain the coming computer age to a nervous, curious public. School boards toured the aisles when deciding whether to invest in classroom computers. For a genuine stretch of time, if a journalist needed a shot of ordinary Americans meeting technology for the first time, the backdrop was almost always the same: a Radio Shack storefront, fluorescent lights humming overhead. Employees who worked the floor during those years describe a particular kind of pride that came from being trusted. Customers didn't walk in assuming they'd be sold something they didn't need. They walked in assuming the person behind the counter actually understood the difference between one battery and another, one radio and another, one computer and another. That trust was the company's real product, long before it was a chain of any size. At the height of its power, Radio Shack had simply managed to scale that trust across thousands of storefronts without losing the feeling of a small shop staffed by someone who knew what they were talking about. The geographic reach mattered too, in a way that's easy to underestimate today. A family in rural Nebraska and a family in suburban New Jersey were having remarkably similar experiences on a Saturday afternoon. The same aisles, the same private label batteries, the same low hum of possibility around the electronics counter. In an era before the internet flattened every regional difference into the same website, Radio Shack was one of the few genuinely national experiences an American family shared, regardless of where they lived. What made this moment so remarkable in hindsight is how ordinary it felt at the time. Nobody walking into a Radio Shack in 1999 thought they were witnessing the peak of anything. It simply felt like Tuesday. The stores would always be there. The batteries would always need replacing. The knowledgeable clerk behind the counter would always be a 5-minute drive away. When an entire generation learns to trust the same small counter in the same familiar store for 4 decades running, what exactly do you call the thing that's lost when that trust has nowhere left to go? Nobody could have said it aloud in 1999, but the very foundation that had made Radio Shack so trusted, its insistence on private label control, its refusal to bend toward outside software standards, had already begun working against it more than a decade earlier, in ways that were only just beginning to surface. The first crack in Radio Shack's foundation didn't look like a crack at all. In 1983, it looked like a triumph. That year, Tandy unveiled the Model 2000, a machine 3 times faster than IBM's own personal computer, engineered with genuine technical ambition, the kind of hardware that should have cemented Radio Shack's place at the front of the computer revolution it had helped to start. Executives had every reason to expect it would sell. It didn't. The problem wasn't speed, it was software. The Model 2000 couldn't run half the programs available for IBM-compatible machines because Radio Shack had spent years insisting that its computers use Radio Shack's own operating systems and Radio Shack's own software, sold exclusively through Radio Shack's own stores. It was the same private label philosophy that had built the company's fortune under Charles Tandy. Buy nothing you can't control, sell nothing you don't manufacture yourself. For 20 years, that instinct had been Radio Shack's greatest strength. Now it was becoming its blind spot. As Apple and IBM-compatible systems flooded the market through the early 80s, software developers built almost exclusively for those platforms, simply because that's where the customers were. A machine faster than an IBM meant nothing to a buyer who couldn't run IBM software on it. The number that told the real story wasn't hidden in a boardroom memo. It was sitting in plain sight in trade publications for anyone who cared to look. In 1984, RadioShack's market share in personal computers stood at 19%. Within a matter of years, it had fallen below 9%, less than half of what it had been. A company that had once introduced America to the very idea of a home computer was now watching competitors it had helped create outsell it in its own category. Imagine for a moment a customer walking into a Radio Shack in the spring of 1984. To him, nothing had changed. The shelves were still full. The clerk still knew his products cold. The Saturday ritual of stopping in for batteries or speaker wire continued exactly as it always had. He had no reason to suspect that a few floors up in Fort Worth, executives were quietly absorbing the fact that their flagship computer line was losing the war for relevance. That's the strange cruelty of dramatic irony in a story like this one. The customer in the aisle and the executive in the boardroom were living in two entirely different timelines, and only one of them knew which way the future was bending. The cracks weren't confined to computers either. Radio Shack's rapid, centrally controlled expansion, the very model that had turned 9 stores into thousands, was now generating friction among the franchise owners who staffed that empire. Many of these owners depended heavily on computer sales for a meaningful share of their revenue. And by the late 1980s, a number of them grew uneasy watching Tandy broaden its computer distribution beyond Radio Shack's own storefronts. If the same products could soon be found elsewhere, cheaper, what exactly was a franchise fee still paying for? In August 1988, a small group of dealers took the unusual step of forming the Radio Shack Dealers Association, openly discussing whether legal action against the parent company might be necessary. It didn't erupt into open warfare, but the trust between headquarters and the men running the stores, the same trust that had powered the company's expansion a decade earlier, had begun to fray. Company leadership's response, to their credit, wasn't denial. Tandy poured money into research and development throughout the late 1980s, pushed the Tandy name onto IBM-compatible machines to compete more directly, and even acquired Silicon Valley laptop maker GRID Systems in 1988 to stay current with where computing was heading. These were the moves of a company that had, in fact, seen the crack and tried to close it. But the deeper problem was harder to engineer around. Radio Shack had built its identity on control, on doing things its own way, inside its own walls, at exactly the moment the computer industry was rewarding openness and compatibility above everything else. How long can a company this trusted keep expanding on the strength of yesterday's formula, while the ground underneath that formula quietly shifts? The fissures of the 1980s hadn't broken Radio Shack. Market share had dropped, certainly, but 7,000 stores still opened their doors every morning, and most Americans still had no reason to doubt the company's staying power. The real danger wasn't the crack itself. It was what Radio Shack's leadership would choose to do, or fail to do. When a far larger threat arrived a decade later, wearing the shape of a website nobody in Fort Worth wanted to take seriously. If the cracks of the 1980s were a warning Radio Shack partially heeded, the decision that followed in the 1990s was the one the company would never fully recover from. In 1994, a small online bookseller called Amazon launched out of a garage in Seattle. Radio Shack did not open its own online store until the year 2000, 6 years. That gap, more than any single boardroom failure, before or since, is widely regarded as the single most consequential mistake in the company's history. The thinking inside Radio Shack's leadership at the time wasn't reckless or careless. It was, in its own way, entirely logical, which is precisely what made it so dangerous. Executives reasoned that customers already had a Radio Shack 5 minutes from home. Why would anyone wait days for a package to arrive when they could simply drive to a familiar storefront and speak to someone who actually understood the product? It was a fair question in 1995. It became the wrong question almost immediately after. As broadband crept into American homes and a generation of shoppers discovered they could compare prices, read reviews, and have batteries or cables delivered without getting in the car at all. Radio Shack's own strength, its physical omnipresence, had quietly become the excuse leadership used to avoid confronting the thing that would eventually replace it. The frontline consequences of that hesitation showed up first not in headquarters memos, but in the experience of the people working the counter. A longtime store manager in the late 1990s would have noticed customers coming in less to buy and more to ask questions, jotting down model numbers, then leaving to search for a better price at home. The knowledgeable clerk, Radio Shack's oldest and most valuable asset, was slowly being reduced to free research for a sale that would happen somewhere else. Leadership instability compounded the problem at exactly the moment steady judgment was needed most. Between 1999 and 2013, Radio Shack cycled through CEO after CEO, a fast food industry veteran, a McDonald's executive, a Kmart turnaround specialist known for aggressive cost-cutting, a string of chief financial officers pressed into the top job during moments of crisis. Each arrived with a different diagnosis and a different cure. One pushed cellular partnerships, another pushed cost discipline. None stayed long enough to see whether their strategy actually worked, and each change of direction left the company's identity a little blurrier than before. That blurring showed up most painfully in what Radio Shack chose to sell. Store-within-a-store partnerships with Sprint and later Verizon transformed sections of the company's floor space away from the parts, tools, and hobbyist electronics that had defined it since 1921 and towards cell phone contracts and wireless plans that any carrier storefront could offer just as well. A customer walking into a Radio Shack in 2008 was now more likely to be pitched a 2-year phone contract than to have a genuine conversation about a soldering iron or a set of resistors. The store that had once been the one place in America that spoke the hobbyist's language increasingly sounded like every other wireless retailer on the block. Behind this drift lay a deeper, more uncomfortable question that would eventually surface in courtrooms as well as sales figures. As Radio Shack leaned harder into cellular partnerships to prop up flagging revenue, it leaned away from the very expertise that had built customer loyalty in the first place. A shift that longtime employees felt acutely, even if they couldn't always name it. Age discrimination lawsuits brought by longtime store managers and employees in the years that followed hinted at a workforce increasingly treated as disposable, even as the company publicly still traded on the goodwill built by decades of knowledgeable service. There was a moment sometime around 2010 when insiders inside the company could see the shape of what was coming, even if it hadn't yet been settled out in public. Online retail had matured from a curiosity into the default way Americans shop for exactly the kind of low-margin electronics Radio Shack specialized in. Batteries, cables, chargers, small parts that carried little brand loyalty and enormous price sensitivity online. A customer no longer needed to trust a clerk's expertise when a product page came stocked with 1,000 reviews from strangers who'd already asked every possible question. The comparative advantage Radio Shack had spent 90 years building, the knowledgeable person behind the counter, had been rendered for an entire category of purchases almost beside the point. The tragedy of Radio Shack's decline in this period is that no single villain made a single catastrophic decision in a single room. It was a slow accumulation of choices that each seemed defensible in isolation. Protect the store network rather than compete with it online. Lean on cellular revenue when core electronics sales soften. Bring in a new CEO with a new plan every time the last plan didn't show results fast enough. Each choice bought a little time. None of them addressed the widening gap between what Radio Shack had always been, a place for expertise and hands-on discovery, and what American retail was rapidly becoming. By the early 2010s, the company that once introduced a nation to the personal computer was now, in the eyes of many younger shoppers, simply the place you went for a phone case or a plan you didn't fully understand. Staffed by employees under mounting pressure to hit sales targets that had less and less to do with the technical passion that had once defined the brand. Who exactly was responsible for protecting the people who had built their careers and their trust around a company that had forgotten what made it worth trusting in the first place? The answer to that question would arrive in the most public way possible, not in a quiet boardroom decision, but in storefronts across the country, in the space of just a few devastating years. By the end of 2014, the warning signs that had been building for 2 decades finally converged into something No clever partnership or leadership reshuffle could paper over. Radio Shack had posted 11 consecutive quarterly losses. 11. Each one a fresh signal to Wall Street, to suppliers, to the company's own employees, that the turnaround everyone kept promising simply wasn't coming. The first public sign that the end was near came not from Radio Shack's leadership, but from its balance sheet itself, laid bare for anyone reading the financial press. In February 2015, the New York Stock Exchange delisted the company's stock, a quiet, almost bureaucratic humiliation for a name that had once been synonymous with American retail confidence. Within days, Radio Shack filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The filing wasn't a surprise to anyone who had been watching closely, but for the tens of thousands of employees still standing behind counters in towns across the country, the news landed exactly as suddenly as if it hadn't been building for years. Picture a store manager in a mid-sized town, someone who had worked that same Radio Shack counter for the better part of 2 decades. He'd started as a teenager, selling batteries and speaker wire, worked his way up through the wireless partnership years, weathered a half-dozen changes in company strategy handed down from headquarters he'd never see. On the morning the bankruptcy filing became public, he learned the news the same way most of his customers did, from a news alert on his phone, standing in the same aisle where he'd once helped a father buy his son's first cordless phone. There was no dramatic company announcement delivered with dignity. There was a headline, and then a very long, very quiet day at work, waiting to find out which stores on the closure list included his own. Across the country, roughly 100 stores were marked for immediate closure as part of the bankruptcy proceedings, with thousands more affected in the months that followed. For customers, the experience was its own kind of quiet grief. A woman who'd been driving to the same Radio Shack for replacement hearing aid batteries for 15 years arrived one Saturday to find the shelves half empty, liquidation signs taped to the windows, a skeleton staff moving through the final days of a store that had outlasted 3 American recessions and a dozen technological shifts. There was no ceremony to it, no local news crew filming a send-off, the way they once had for the TRS-80's arrival decades earlier. Just empty shelves, a locked door, and a strip mall parking lot with one less reason to visit. In May 2015, the company's assets were purchased out of bankruptcy by General Wireless, a subsidiary of the investment firm Standard General, for $26.2 million, a fraction of what a single flagship Radio Shack real estate portfolio might once have been worth at the company's peak. It was an unmistakable signal of how far the brand had fallen. A name that had operated 7,500 stores at its height was now being valued, in its entirety, at less than the cost of a modest office building. The reprieve didn't last. Under General Wireless, Radio Shack limped forward for less than 2 years, propped up in part by a store-within-a-store partnership with Sprint that echoed the very strategy that had hollowed out the brand's identity a decade earlier. In March 2017, General Wireless and its subsidiaries filed for bankruptcy a second time. This time, there was no meaningful attempt to preserve the physical store network at all. The company announced it would shift primarily to an online-only business, effectively conceding 6 years too late the very battle it had refused to fight back in 2000. The final closures in 2017 carried none of the emotional weight of the 2015 collapse, and that, in its own way, was the saddest part. By then, Radio Shack's disappearance had become almost unremarkable, a formality completing itself rather than a national story. Press coverage was thin. There were no widely shared photographs of a final day. No crowds gathering for one last purchase the way customers sometimes do for a beloved local business. The stores that closed in this second wave did so the way a light bulb dims rather than a light switch clicks off, a slow fade that most of the country had already stopped watching by the time it finished. What makes Radio Shack's story sharper, rather than smaller, is that it wasn't happening in isolation. On the other side of the Atlantic, a strikingly similar story was unfolding in almost exact parallel. Maplin, Britain's own beloved chain for electronics hobbyists, founded in 1972 by 2 enthusiasts frustrated by how hard it was to find decent components, had grown from a bedroom mail order operation into 217 stores across the United Kingdom by 2017. Like Radio Shack, Maplin had built its identity on knowledgeable staff and hands-on discovery for hobbyists. Like Radio Shack, it had passed through the hands of private equity owners, more concerned with extracting value than investing in the stores themselves. And like Radio Shack, it simply couldn't compete with the price and convenience of online retail. In February 2018, Maplin entered administration. By June that year, every single store had closed for good. Two nations, two beloved chains born from the same instinct, a genuine love of tinkering, of soldering irons and spare parts, and the quiet satisfaction of building something with your own hands. Both had scaled that instinct into a national institution. Both had been undone by the same force, arriving at almost exactly the same time, as if the entire model of the neighborhood electronics counter had quietly expired on both sides of the ocean within a single calendar year of each other. For the Radio Shack employees who lived through the final closures, there was no severance worth mentioning, no pension fund waiting to soften the landing, no guarantee that decades of technical knowledge would count for anything in whatever came next. Franchise owners who had built their livelihoods around a Radio Shack storefront were left holding leases nobody wanted to take over, in strip malls increasingly dotted with empty units. Some found new careers in the electronics industry they knew so well. Others simply walked away from retail altogether, taking with them a kind of expertise that had, quite suddenly, stopped being commercially valuable to anyone. When the lights of the last store finally went dark, what exactly had been lost? The batteries and cables that any website could now sell just as easily, or something far harder to replace. The simple human experience of a person who actually knew what they were talking about, standing ready behind a counter, waiting for you to ask. Nobody at Radio Shack and nobody at Maplin had set out to destroy that experience. It had simply been outcompeted, quarter after quarter, by something faster and cheaper that didn't need a storefront, a knowledgeable clerk, or a neighborhood at all. What remained afterward wasn't rubble or scandal, it was silence. The particular, specific silence of a strip mall parking lot where a familiar sign no longer lit up at dusk. In the years that followed both collapses, the space Radio Shack and Maplin once occupied didn't stay empty for long. It simply changed hands. Amazon absorbed the low-margin, high-frequency purchases that had once justified a trip to the local Radio Shack. Batteries, cables, chargers, the small, unglamorous items that had quietly kept the lights on for 90 years. Best Buy picked up much of what remained of the higher-value electronics trade, offering the same knowledgeable staff model Radio Shack had pioneered decades earlier, but built for a customer who arrived already having read a dozen reviews online. Neither competitor needed a story within a story cellular partnership or a private label battery brand to win. They simply offered the same convenience Radio Shack had spent 2 decades resisting. The Radio Shack name didn't vanish entirely, though what survived bore little resemblance to the company that had once operated 7,500 stores. Retail e-commerce ventures, the same investment group that had scooped up other fallen American names like Pier 1 and Dress Barn out of bankruptcy, acquired the brand and repositioned it as an online-only retailer, betting that decades of name recognition still carried commercial value even without a single physical storefront behind it. A handful of independently owned and franchised Radio Shack stores continued operating here and there, scattered survivors of a network that had once blanketed the country. In May 2023, control of the global Radio Shack business passed again, this time to the Unicomer Group, a Central American retail conglomerate. A quiet, almost anticlimactic final chapter for a name once synonymous with American technological confidence. Maplin followed a nearly identical path. After its 2018 collapse, the brand was acquired by a new company and relaunched in 2019 as an online-only retailer, selling electronics, security equipment, and computing supplies under the same familiar name and the same recognizable branding. No physical Maplin store ever reopened. The legal obligations of the original company, warranty support, customer commitments built up over decades, simply weren't carried over to the new owners. In both countries, the brand had technically survived. The thing that had actually made it valuable had not. That parallel resurrection tells its own quiet story about what the industry learned from watching both companies fall. A name still carries weight, even stripped of everything that once gave it meaning. But a name alone can't replicate the specific, irreplaceable value both chains had once offered, without even realizing how rare it was. A person standing behind a counter who genuinely understood the product, in a store within walking distance of home, ready to answer a question a search engine could only guess at. The broader lesson for American and British retail wasn't subtle, even if it took two bankruptcies and a transatlantic echo to make it undeniable. Physical retail built around low-margin, easily comparable products cannot survive purely on the loyalty of memory. It survives only by offering something a website genuinely cannot: expertise, immediacy, and trust built face-to-face over years, not algorithms built to guess what a customer might want next. RadioShack and Maplin had both possessed that trust in abundance. Neither figured out how to make it commercially decisive once the internet offered convenience at a scale no storefront could match. The economic toll on the communities that had depended on these stores was harder to measure than a stock price, but no less real. Franchise owners who had spent decades building a livelihood around a single storefront found themselves starting over in their 50s and 60s in an industry that had little use for their specific expertise. Longtime store managers, the same people who had once been trusted with a neighborhood's questions about its first home computer, discovered that 30 years of technical knowledge translated into surprisingly few job openings once the stores themselves were gone. Some found new footing in electronics repair, security systems installation, or independent consulting. Others simply left the industry that had defined their working lives, taking with them an expertise that had, almost overnight, stopped being something anyone was willing to pay for. What made both collapses so quietly devastating wasn't the loss of a place to buy batteries. It was the disappearance of something far harder to rebuild, a shared physical space where curiosity about technology had once been welcomed, explained, and encouraged by someone who genuinely cared whether you understood it. What do we lose exactly when the one place built for asking questions about the future disappears and nothing quite manages to take its place? Picture a Radio Shack on a Saturday afternoon, sometime in the late 1970s. The bell above the glass door gives a single, familiar chime. Inside, the air smells faintly of solder and fresh plastic packaging, warmed by fluorescent lights humming overhead. Pegboards stretch along the walls, hung with coils of copper wire, spare antennas, and rows of batteries in every size a household could need. In the corner, a small crowd has gathered around a beige machine with a chunky keyboard, its screen glowing a soft, patient green. A boy sits before it, fingers hovering, watching a simple line of code make a ball bounce across the display, again and again, as if the machine itself were inviting him to ask how. Somewhere across the Atlantic, in a similarly modest shop in Essex, another boy is doing much the same thing, flipping through a Maplin catalog thick with circuit diagrams, imagining the radio he might build from a page of parts and instructions. What made these stores matter was never really about the batteries, the cables, or even the computers themselves. It was about the particular kind of trust that grew between a curious customer and a clerk who genuinely knew the answer. A trust built one conversation at a time, over decades, in thousands of small storefronts most people barely thought twice about. A father teaching his son to solder a broken wire wasn't just fixing a radio. He was passing along a habit of curiosity that Radio Shack and Maplin had helped make ordinary, even respectable, in a way few other businesses ever manage. For a certain generation on both sides of the Atlantic, these stores were the first place technology stopped being frightening and started being something you could simply pick up and understand, piece by piece, with a patient stranger's help. That mattered more than any single product line ever could. It meant that an ordinary family, with no particular expertise and no special connections, could walk into an unremarkable storefront and leave feeling just a little more capable of understanding the world that was rapidly changing around them. Nothing that came after, not the reviews, not the algorithms, not the overnight delivery, ever quite replaced that particular human feeling of being taught something by someone who wanted you to learn it. Somewhere tonight, someone is describing the hum of a TRS-80 booting up to a grandchild who has never heard a modem, never touched a soldering iron, never needed to ask a stranger behind a counter how something works. The grandchild won't fully understand what's being described, but they'll understand, from the care and the telling, that something real once stood in towns across two countries, patient, knowledgeable, and quietly proud of what it offered. Radio Shack and Maplin are gone now, their storefronts replaced by websites that answer questions a search bar was never quite built to ask with any warmth. But the people who built them, staffed them, and walked through their doors as curious children deserve to be remembered clearly and without sentimentality. They were part of how an ordinary person once learned to meet the future without fear. That is worth remembering. That is worth keeping.